When it comes to horror films, most people agree the best of the best came out in the 80s. It's hard for me to disagree. I mean, I worked on a documentary trilogy about this exact subject. However, much like how horror didn't start in the 80s, it didn't end there either. There are so many great horror films from the 90s that all too often get overlooked for whatever reason. I'm gonna fix that. Here's 5 awesome horror films from the 90s that you probably overlooked. Resurrection. Resurrection's the 1999 horror thriller from director Russell Mulcahy. And that's right, the director of the original Highlander. This isn't Mulcahy's first foray into horror either. In fact, his first feature was the completely underappreciated horror movie Razorback, which I covered extensively a few years ago. The movie revolves around a detective who's investigating a very unusual serial killer that dismembers his victims and keeps a piece of each one. It turns out he's using the parts. I'm not going to spoil it, but man, take my word for it, it's something crazy. It's a brutal, creepy, and downright weird movie that doesn't shy away from showing you the aftermath of these vicious killings. Christopher Lambert's outstanding here, playing things much more seriously than some of his other roles. He works incredibly well with Mulcahy, and I would have loved for them to have been able to make more movies together. Apparently, Lambert, Mulcahy, and the writer Brad Merman were working on another project, but the concept of Resurrection came up and they liked it so much, they ditched the other one and moved ahead with this one. The movie unfortunately came out in the wake of the horror crime thriller Seven, and as such, it was largely compared to it. If this came out before Seven, it may have been received a little bit better, rather than being called a ripoff, which it really wasn't. Exploitation, possibly, but more so just an idea that they decided to go with since studios were greenlighting films similar to this around that time. Remember all the off-kilter crime films from that era? The film got a theatrical release in most of the world, but for whatever reason, it went direct-to-video in the US and later premiered on cable, which is where I first saw it. The movie was a Canadian-US co-production, which makes it even weirder that it didn't get a theatrical release in the US. The film originally received an NC-17 rating and had to have some of its more vicious scenes trimmed down to get an R. Mulcahy hoped to one day release the full uncut version. The movie received a restoration from Vinegar Syndrome not too long ago, but it's still the theatrical version. Considering that Vinegar Syndrome often goes out of its way to find the uncut versions of cult films, if they didn't release it here, it's very likely the footage is just lost. If you like the crime thrillers of the time and want to see one that has a good dose of brutality, you should give this one a look. Bad Moon. In my humble opinion, there aren't enough good werewolf movies. Sure, there's plenty of vampire films of all kinds, but werewolves don't get the quality they deserve. Bad Moon is one of the quality ones. Bad Moon's a 1996 horror film from director Eric Red. The movie's based on the novel Thor by Wayne Smith. The novel was about a German shepherd named Thor. He lives with a family that gets a visit from the mother's brother, who is a werewolf. The novel's told from the dog's perspective, as he's trying to defend the family that doesn't know the truth about the brother. The movie took the more traditional route and made it from the family's perspective, but they didn't downplay the importance of the dog. He's still one of the main characters, as he's the one constantly trying to warn the family they're in imminent danger. While I think the dog POV worked in the novel, I don't know if it would have translated as well as a movie. As such, I think the film works incredibly well with this change, and it's a very tense werewolf movie. However, the critics disagreed. The movie did poorly when it was first released, and the critics bashed it. This always baffled me, as I thought it was a terrific and unique take on werewolf movies. Having the dog be the hero of the film and defending the family, who doesn't even know they're in danger for a good chunk of the movie. This leads to a showdown between Thor and the werewolf, and it's just awesome. Aside from one effect, which I'll get into in a moment, the werewolf looks great. There was a scene in the original cut where Uncle Ted, played by Michael Pare, is changing into his werewolf form. It looks really bad, and the director hated it, but had to leave it in. So in 2016, when he worked with Shout Factory to release the film on Blu-ray, he was able to go in and remove that shot and have the film certified as his director's cut. The theatrical is also on the disc if you want to see the bad visual. He said it's bothered him for over 2 decades, and fans have been complaining for about just as long. Thor is another example of how we just don't deserve dogs. Body Melt. Do you like disgusting body horror? Oh, have I got a movie for you. Body Melt is a 1993 Australian satirical horror film from director Philip Brophy. It's about the small town of Pebbles Court of Hemsville in Melbourne that is being used as a testing grounds for a new experimental diet drug. The drug works. It helps the person lose weight. It unfortunately works a little too well, as it causes the person's skin to melt and for them to die a horrible death. Sometimes it does other things, but in general, it always leads to death. If you're familiar with Australian cinema, exploitation, and especially Australian soap operas, you will enjoy this movie even more. It's a great satire of Australian TV, most notably the show Neighbours, the longest-running Australian TV show. Neighbours is a show where numerous stars got their start. Guy Pearce, Russell Crowe, Radha Mitchell, Margot Robbie, Kylie Minogue, and Natalie Imbruglia, to name a few. The movie even has actor Ian Smith from Neighbours as one of the doctors. The main element of the satire is the obsession with health through pills instead of healthy living. Body Melt is absolutely disgusting. On top of people melting, it's full of tentacles, mutations, exploding stomachs, and even exploding penises. By the end of the movie, almost everyone has died a horrible death. It's also full of pitch-black humor, but that's something that's fairly common in most exploitation films. It's an uncomfortable but disgustingly fun look at Australian life as told through gallons of explosive body fluids. It's on Blu-ray and also playing on Tubi if you want to check it out. Just don't eat anything while you're watching it. Blood and Donuts. There's a place between the living and the dead, and it's open 24 hours. Blood and Donuts is a 1995 comedic horror film from director Holly Dale. I don't say it's a horror comedy simply because it's a more serious film with some comedy sprinkled throughout. It's more in line with something like An American Werewolf in London than Shaun of the Dead. This is one of the most unique films I've ever seen about vampires. It's about a vampire who wakes up after being asleep for 25 years and is trying to figure out how to fit back into this different world. He's been asleep since 1969, and it's now 1994. The world is much different now than the one that he left. He spends his evenings at a local all-night coffee and donut place. While there, he befriends some of the patrons and starts to fall in love with the waitress Molly. The vampire does not drink human blood anymore, but rats and pigeons' blood instead. One of the reasons he went into hiding was to get away from his old girlfriend Rita. She's been looking for him for about 25 years and is not happy about it. An interesting casting choice has famed director David Cronenberg playing the local crime boss. This was back in the 90s when he was dabbling in acting. On a side note, he also has a small part in Resurrection. The movie has some interesting parallels between drug use and vampirism, and is a much deeper film than the title would lead you to expect. This was Holly Dale's first narrative film, as she had previously only done documentaries. This was also the first film to be produced by the Canadian Film Centre, and it does have that Canadian vibe to it. It feels a bit like it could have been a TV show. The movie occasionally pops up on Amazon Prime, but it's not available to stream anywhere right now. It's available on DVD, but it's out of print. You can usually find it on eBay. I'm amazed this film still hasn't been picked up for restoration. It's well done, the acting and directing are great, and aside from some occasionally sketchy effects, it looks good. I think this is a movie where it really is more about the story anyway, so it's easy to overlook some minor imperfections. If you can track it down, do so. Ravenous. Ravenous is a 1999 horror film directed by Antonia Bird. Out of all of these, this is probably the most well-known. Even still, it's not as well known as it should be. Ravenous is about a military outpost in the 19th century. Some soldiers go on a rescue mission and discover the colonel at an outpost has resorted to cannibalism, which has given him incredible power but also a need to eat more human flesh. The movie was inspired by the story of Alfred Packer, the Colorado cannibal, an American prospector and wilderness guide who confessed to resorting to cannibalism during the winter of 1874. This also inspired the movie Cannibal the Musical. I want a thing about it now. Yeah. It's amazing to me this movie was made. This is the kind of movie that usually does not get a $12 million budget. It's a vicious and mean-spirited film with a very dark sense of humor. You have actors like Guy Pearce and Robert Carlyle going head-to-head as super cannibals without so much as a wink to the camera. It's awesome. The movie flopped horribly when it hit theaters, but it's since found its audience over the years. Critics were torn. While some enjoyed it for being so far outside the box, others complained it was simply too weird. I've always loved and stood by this film, but my friends hate it. So I'm recommending it anyway, and hopefully it resonates with some of you. I think it's worth checking out simply because this is something you won't likely see again. The movie's available on video on demand, but it's not streaming. However, it does have a very nice Blu-ray from Shout. That's 5 more movies to watch. If you're interested in learning more about awesome 90s horror films, keep an eye out for In Search of Darkness 90s, Parts 1 and 2. We'll be launching the crowdfunding for those very soon. Hope you check them out. I've got some big episodes planned on movies I've been wanting to cover in depth for years. I'm glad you guys are enjoying the different styles of videos. I'll see you next time.